Bonjour à tous et bien.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session entitled How Can We Improve on Social Mobility? Social contract is based on an ideal of upward social mobility for yourself and for your children. Yellow Vests movement have shown that there is a gap between the normal vision and the situation on the ground. I looked at an OECD study. It takes 6 generations for the children of a family to reach average income, but those who are at the top of that income ladder stay at the top. So, can we talk of a stalled social mobility? How can we fight that rigidity? What are the solutions? So, we're going to discuss this with Hervé who's chief researcher at the EHESS. You've looked at rural areas, but also peri-urban areas, and you're going to tell us more about the reality of social mobility in France. Bernard Gainnier, you are the chairman of PwC, and you're also at the head of 2 associations, Move Up and Telemac, that specialized in reintegrating people from disadvantaged areas. Should we try and make it so that social mobility works better by being more coercive? Fabien Roussel, you are the Secretary General of the French Communist Party, and Éric Lombard, you're the Director General of the Caisse des Dépots, and Saïd Hammouche, you're a social entrepreneur, the CEO of the HR recruiting firm Mozaïk, and you fight social inequalities and discrimination against young people coming from working class and disadvantaged areas. 1/4 of young people who apply for jobs actually do not get a job interview because of their coming from the wrong ethnic group or wrong disadvantaged area. And Akiko, over to you. So, improving social mobility, yes, but what? What kind of social mobility? Mobility, unlike inequality, is a dynamic concept. Inequality is a snapshot of the society at a given time, whereas social mobility is a sort of film that you watch with the main characters being children and parents. So, to what extent does your education, your profession is determined by the socioeconomic status of your parents? First, there's absolute mobility, is how your living standard changes from a generation to another. So is the ships on the sea that follow the waves, either upward or downward. In France, absolute social mobility works pretty well with a social protection system that acts as a buffer, which is what it's done during the first few months of the health crisis, which is to contain social damage. And we hope that it's going to work still next year. But social mobility can be relative. It's like changing ranks. So if there is the same number of places to be allocated, upward mobility for a person means that there's going to be downward mobility for another. In fact, social mobility in France has been upward social mobility because the private sector has created executive jobs as new graduates came to the job market. But let's come to that relative social mobility. Does my rank depend on the status of my parents? It is the case, but not as much as 30 years ago, thanks to the democratization of the education system. But the problem is the deterioration of the situation for unskilled unskilled people without degrees. And over the last few months that we've gone through, we've seen how important people who are collecting bins, people who are at the till in supermarkets, people who are auxiliary nurses are important. How can we contain social damage? How can we preserve absolute social mobility? And how can we protect relative social mobility and make our house a bigger house and a more welcoming house for all? Those are the questions I would invite you to discuss. Well, Hervé Lebras, can we start with you? You are an expert in demographics and a historian. Can we truly say that there's a stalled social mobility in France? Stalled is maybe a bit strong a word. I would say that it has been slowed down significantly. And in the few surveys and studies that we carry out, when we compare people who are 30 years old to the situation of their parents when they were 30 years old, we can see that social mobility still occurs, but in more restricted segments. There's one segment at the bottom. Your father was a manual laborer, for example, and so you could be a foreman, but you have very few chances to go higher in the social ladder. If your father was an employee, you could become an executive. But as Akiko aptly put it, people who are at the top can go slightly downward in the social ladder, but they will hardly ever go to the bottom, which might justify certain populist speeches. So I'll speak as a statistician by giving you 4 figures. At the census of 1968, there were 6% of the working age population that could be placed in the executive and self-employed part of the population. And we also had 6% of people who had higher studies. So amongst the 6% that had degrees, they had a good chance of going upwards in the social ladder. Currently, 16% are now in the socio-professional category of executives. So from 6% to 16%, you could argue that there's progress. But 6% of people in 1968 didn't have a degree. Now it's 36%. So that has deteriorated. But with the same level of degrees, there are other factors. It's the social environment and your network. So I think that has generated a lot of discontent. You mentioned the Yellow Vests movement. Part of that discontent stemmed from questions that had to do with car and petrol prices. And some people were just in a bad mood, to put it mildly. But that social blockage for part of the Yellow Vests, when you listen to them, they actually had, for some of them, done some higher studies. But so we have a problem here that is linked with the image of a degree in French society, is the problem of meritocracy, you know, the promise that the Republic makes to everyone. If you have a degree, if you make higher studies, if you do higher studies, you will go up the social ladders. So how can we rectify that situation? You see that there are determining factors that are very strong. How can you react to what Eric Lombard has just said? You are the head of 2 associations, Bernard Gainnier. Well, I think the question is how reality is perceived. I can see when I go, in the field, what people's perception is. Parents are anxious. There's a lot of anxiety about the possibility of a loss of social status. And there's a lot of initiatives to try and support our children. To me, social mobility doesn't work anymore. So there's more anxiety than before. Oh yes, I think French society lacks self-confidence. And I think now is the time to act. It's no longer the time to make observations. And we have to change our approach. When we compare France with the other OECD countries, there's a gap, as you underlined before. Now's the time to act, to change our methodology. And I think the main focus of our action is to change our perception and probably also to look at things differently. When we go back to work in September, it's bound to be very difficult, and I would recommend to companies as an audit and consultancy firm. I try to support them, so I would recommend that companies keep up putting in efforts and get involved. All stakeholders need to work together. I really believe in a coalition. I don't believe in a top-down solution. That's what Eric Lombard said. We lack a collective perception. So we have to play on that lever of perception. Yes. We have to convince people that it is possible. French people, degrees are not enough anymore. And that social determining factor, which is the cause of the stalled social mobility in France, we need to really work together. When you have on your CV an address in a disadvantaged area of the Paris region, that doesn't look good. But why? Why this rejection? Because the perception of people is that, companies do not want to take risks. So companies need to make more effort and go further. So stakeholders, be they politicians or a Caisse des Dépots as an investment bank in the public sector, all these stakeholders need to share the same perception and need to coordinate. Fabien Roussel, maybe you want to respond to what's been said. Can we talk of a stalled social mobility in France? Oh, it's more than stalled. It's out of order. Maybe I'll jar slightly with what's been said. Maybe my interpretation is a Marxist interpretation of the economic environment, because we talk of social classes, and I'm going to talk about class struggle. For us, social mobility is the possibility for salaried workers to move upwards throughout their life by having access to training, and so that they have a right to move upward. Nowadays, it is no longer the case. It used to be the case 30 or 40 years ago when there were big companies, when we had permanent contracts for all that were generalized, with the possibility to make people redundant, but not as easily as nowadays. But that was the economic boom post-World War II, yes. But social mobility was a way for companies to keep their labor force. And it was also a way in mines. I actually am an elected representative in a former mining community, and also in the automotive sector, because I have some big automotive plants in my constituency. It was also a possibility to involve that working class and that mining community. It's no longer true. The working class that has only its arms and brains to sell, today that working class is fragmented, it's atomized, it's damaged, it is divided. Big companies have gone. Permanent contracts have almost gone. I could mention the all-pervasiveness of temporary contracts on building sites, for example. I could tell you about subcontractors that work in big companies. I was at Airbus a couple of days ago, and I met with people from Richebourg. They're a subcontractor to Airbus, and they have a subcontractor status that costs 20% less than an Airbus employee. So work organization has been so completely disrupted under the pressure of finance, of banks, of capital, that always ache for more. So the labor environment has been so completely disrupted that there's such an army of unemployed, as Marx put it. There's so much unemployment in our country that we can tap into that pool and put those employees, depending on their degrees, where we please, at the salary we please, even if they have degrees, which is why I think that social mobility has stalled and that is actually non-existent anymore. Right. Eric Lombard. So more job insecurity, mass unemployment. Well, maybe not so much respond as to add to what Fabien Roussel said. Essentially, what Fabien Roussel is pointing to is to a surge in inequalities, and that's a fact. That surge in inequality is the product of our political and economic system. So something's not working. That's a fact. So I think we agree, even though we do not use the same words. One of the role of the Caisse des Dépots is precisely to help support social mobility and fight social inequalities. I'd like to tell you about local communities and local areas. I think we need to fight what is objectively the situation, which is that depending where you're born, your chances are not the same. If you were born in the right places, you will have chances that others won't have. So I think there are two types of policies that can help respond to that. Policies that are geared towards recreating equality between those different areas. So targeted at certain types of local areas or local communities. So the disadvantaged areas in the suburbs have been targeted by urban affairs policies. But we see that in local communities where, for example, the housing has been renovated, the image of those neighborhoods can change, and that can change a lot. But that also is true of cities, medium-sized cities. 25% of French people live in those medium-sized cities. So if you look at Douai in the former mining community, is a part of the country in the north where they've made an effort to try and enhance their attractiveness for the business community. And there are other places in the country industry where there hasn't been that proactive policy to enhance attractiveness. Well, policies should be proactive by definition. With incentives, yes, these policies work. And we're going to launch a policy that we've entitled the Small Towns of Tomorrow in rural areas, so that there's a rebalancing of chances and jobs. So broadband is a must. We've seen it in areas where there was no internet. People can't work remotely, they can't get trained. So that's the digital divide. Yes, we have sped up that process. I was a couple of days ago in a small municipality of 30, with a population of 33. Well, we've made sure that broadband was set up. And so we work with a number of associations, but I let the gentleman from Mozaïk speak. We have to make sure that those people without degrees can go back onto the job market. And I don't want to be too long, but I think we have also to make sure that in the industry comes back in those local communities, because industry is the possibility for these people to have permanent contracts. But industry has left the French territory for decades now. Yes, but because we've actually given up on industry. So this is where we need a proactive. I was in Venary-les-Beaunes in Côte d'Or, and there's a plant there that is going to be developed, and the size is going to increase threefold. Why? Because there's been a proactive local policy so as to free up the land for that extension. So what I'm talking about is more equality between those local areas and local community. We have to support those local areas that are disadvantaged.
Vous avez créé Mozaïk RH.
Saïd, HAMMOUCHE, you have created Mozaïk RH. It was an association turned into a business and then becoming a foundation. Why do we have a quarter of graduates with the wrong name or the wrong address who do not even get a chance to be interviewed? Because we in France are all stalled by prejudice, and this leads to stereotypes, which lead to job discrimination. When we are faced with a profile, a specific profile, and when we review CVs that are different from our standards, we may be perturbed. And if we're not aware of our own bias and of the capacity that people have to change and to create value, we mechanically apply our reflexes, and that leads to social cloning. So how can we fight against these prejudices? The first step is to raise awareness, to do away with denial. And I really want to salute the researchers who are documenting this situation. Yes, discrimination exists. It is not fun. It's not a fantasy. And discrimination and inequality is really feeding feelings of victimization, communitarism, and radicalization at the end of the day. And we have to realize that it is a consequence of our society, and this has huge costs for everybody. If we were able to invest in proactive policies, anticipation and prevention, we could help these restore hope in young people and restore the principles of equal opportunity, equality, quite simply. So how do you operate on the ground to improve social mobility? Well, very modestly, we believe that we had to invest in social innovation to fight against discrimination. So we created a new type of hiring company. We created a recruitment platform that's accessible, free of charge for corporations and for candidates. We really wanted to help empower candidates. We coached them, and we fertilized this know-how throughout the French territory by irrigating a network of specialized agencies. So we have spread best practices through initiatives such as the top 10 of diversity recruiters in the Ministry of Finance. We have created coalitions with business leaders, public players, and we are creating a foundation, equity-based. So it's a hybrid model. We want to both provide a high-quality service to hire, train, and advise. And also, we want to raise awareness. We want to invest in innovation to give a new lease of life to France. So the local dimension is key now, if I understand you. It's no longer a national thing. So we have 15 minutes left. We have many questions coming up. I would like to maybe qualify what Eric Lombard just said about an inequality. When we look at the measurement of inequality, it's the Gini index, it has sharply decreased since until 2000. But since year 2000, it has inched up. But it's still lower than in neighboring countries. So there's a lot to say about the feeling of inequality. Tocqueville said that he was very surprised in the U.S. whether the areas where there's more equality, the feeling of inequality is higher. So that's an interesting paradox. The feeling that your neighbor is more affluent than you are. That's what Akiko called relative social climbing. We have a feeling that we should deserve a certain position in the social ladder based on our our diploma, for example. We don't make it. And in countries with a lot of inequality, we know very well that we won't make it. So So we should not confuse the feeling of inequality and the actual level of inequality. Briefly, think local. That's not to say think local town or anything. It's not based on cities, but it's also based on regions. In France, we clearly have some areas, some regions that are doing well and others that are not doing well. In Languedoc-Roussillon, for example, unemployment rate in young people is 3 times as high as in Mayenne or other regions. So there's a lot to say about, a lot to do on regional level. And that would be one of the roles of the regional reforms that are considered. We have to do what they have done in Germany and Länder at the Länder level. Bernard Grenier, yes, on action. We have to change our perspective, the way we look at things, through collective action. I spend all my day helping my teams to think differently. We have training on awareness, to raising awareness. When I had Move Up or Telemac, bringing corporations on board and pushing them to take a different look and to commit to offer jobs to people from disadvantaged neighborhoods. And We Move Up is going to identify these people. And so we, out of 150 companies we send them, we have 4 answers. The system is stalled. The system doesn't work. It's silo-based, and it's not taking a collective perspective on the problem. And we have to change this. Fabien Roussel, a number of questions for you. Should we do away with the absolute principle of Republican equality to recognize differences between individuals and promote really effective policies? That's one of the questions from our viewers. I don't think so. I think the problem is more deep-seated. There is discrimination based on origin. That is true. But, for example, in my area, in the north of France, there's a Peugeot company that has industrial plants throughout the EU, and that is exploiting competition between people across Europe. They have hired workers from Poland and Spain to work in French on French sites, French plants in Valenciennes. And so we have denounced this, not because we don't want Poles or Spaniards in our place, but because we do not accept this mobility, geographic mobility. That means that employees tomorrow, be they French, Romanian, or will have to work 1,000 kilometers away from home because just to accommodate companies. And employees are not slaves that should disrupt their family life and be moved around like pawns. It's not a matter of social origin, but it's because there are corporations, multinational corporations, that are using employees like expandable value just to make more profit and to make more dividends for shareholders. And we have to talk about living conditions, working conditions for employees based on the work they are providing. So we have to regain control on finance, on capital, and provide more power to employees in corporations so that they themselves may have an impact on promotion, mobility, training, and foster more justice and more rights for employees in corporations. So it's more deep-seated than the issue of disadvantaged neighborhoods that I'm fully aware of. But it's about having the same rights for all, no matter their origins, social origins, or national origins. That is very Republican. Indeed, very Republican indeed, replacing Republic in the center. That should be our objective. Yeah, more Republican principles in corporations is more equality for employees, no matter where they come. And it's we want the state to play their role. I do not share the view that we should give more power to regions to play on this. But we are not Germany. France is a republic, and we don't want lenders to rule the economy in our country. France should have rules and make sure that employees have the same rules and that those rights are enforced. And today we're seeing that employees have less and less rights. There's more and more precarity, and this is the reason why we do not have any social mobility. More and more pressure on workers, technicians, engineers, executives. So we need to change corporations. Yes, absolutely. National policy must regain control on this country to ensure more rights to each citizen and to make sure that each citizen, through work, can achieve a normal life, family life with their children. And the Republic should enforce this. And today we no longer have this. Multinationals have taken over. We're seeing this with Peugeot, the example I've just mentioned. We're seeing this at Airbus, Sanofi, where the president just gave 200 million euros to the pharmaceutical industry. And just 1 week after, we have 1,000 job cuts, including engineers and researchers. Whereas it's the core of this industry. So yes, the Republic should regain its rights. Yes, we all agree on the objective, the Republican objective. No positive discrimination. Yes, Peugeot, I just want to establish fact. Peugeot did not bring people from Poland to work there. That's not true. There are people who were already training and who were... Yes, that is done through a competitivity agreement that had been drafted by the management of PHA in 2016. So following this competitive agreement, employees have forced social mobility. They have to work in different countries. So Bernard Gaignier, you say that it was a previous agreement. Well, yeah, it's Peugeot employees that are being trained in France. That's all it is. Éric Lombard, what's your take on this idea that the government and the state should act rather than regions? Yes, these are. I'm strongly in favor of decentralization. We have a question saying, like, should we use more decentralization to improve mobility? Yes, indeed. Well, there are Republican rules, and we're not going to change the French tradition, and that is very important. However, on the daily basis, as we saw during this health crisis, regions were very important because they're closer to the field, the ground. We at Caisse de Dépots have set up funds for different regions, including les Hauts-de-France, the north, to support SMEs, associations, with a much more responsive way than it could have been done at state level. The state is not as agile. So regions have a very important role to play. I share your point of view, Hervé Lebrun. I know that I'm aware that there are differences from region to region. And finally, in France, we are very fond of formal equality. That's very important for us. But sometimes formal equality conceal real equality. And that's exactly what we're seeing in hiring. Legally, the rules for hiring are the same for all. However, we see that people from disadvantaged neighborhoods have a harder time being hired. So that's different from the law. So we have to change this through law. So it's a matter of enforcement, not of right. Well, I am against positive discrimination. However, we need to be proactive. We also have an agreement with Mozaïk RH. Because if we want equal opportunity, we have to roll up our sleeves. We do not want to change the law, but we need to change the way major players are operating. Saïd, yes, we have come to a point where solutions exist. But we have a hard time creating a new model. We need a new model. Well, does this go through law? Yes, indeed. But if we had a more proactive law on, for example, hiring targets that we could have for all corporations that have hiring needs, if we could hire juniors in strategic functions and within corporations, initiatives like this could make a new model emerge. If we are doing piecemeal action, even if we're very sincere, but we're not able to be supported by a powerful, strong model with a clear direction, we won't make it. Well, yes, the principle of equality exists in law. That's true, but we see that it's not real. We need to reinvest and to use new methods, new logics. Maybe possibly with a new operator that supports these initiatives throughout the year, both in public and private sectors, for startup companies and state-owned companies, everything. We need to reinvest both in terms of political vision and in implementation of concrete actions. Bernard Gaignier. we have to change our governance in many areas in the context of this crisis and the post-crisis, in the way roles and responsibilities are distributed between state, region, players, with a coalition of proximity and the state, and regulation. All of this needs to be overhauled. Right now, our system is not working anymore. Is that because we have an overlay of... Yes, we both need to streamline and provide more meaning, clarify responsibilities. Hervé Lebras, let me give you an example of problem raised by formal equality. We talked about the COVID situation. If you compare two extreme départements, both Ariège and Territoire de Belfort, in terms of death rate, there was 80 times as many deaths per capita than in Ariège. So you cannot apply the same law. However, the lockdown rules were the same across the territory. Yes, well, that was helpful because it avoided precisely movements between Ariège and Territoire de Belfort, and that is what the U.S. are up against because they cannot adjust circulation between states. But once there was no circulation possible between one department to another, there was no need of a lockdown in Ariège because there was no initial pool. Fabien, ROUSSEL, a brief conclusion. We have very little time left. There's no other solution than to completely overhaul our economic system. The huge amount of resources, including public resources, that are placed at the service of the business world to solve the crisis, 460 billion euros of public spending should be put to maintain jobs and salaries for all. We need to save jobs, nature, and climate. There's no other solution. Unless we do this, we will have more problems, more jobs precarity, and more competitions between employees that are causing this stalled social mobility. Well, we're up against large challenges. We all agree on this at least. Thank you very much, Hervé Lebras, Fabien ROUSSEL, Hervé Lombard, Saïd HAMMOUCHE. Thank you, Akiko, SUWA-EISENMANN, for helping me prepare this session, and thanks for your attention. Thank you.